All right, good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with our Education and Culture Committee meeting. This morning, we're going to be talking with our Board of Education about our capital improvements program. Let me turn it over to Mr. Levchenko and Mr. Howard first.
Yeah, I do want to emphasize this is the first meeting. We will be meeting again in late March. So this is intended to really introduce the committee to the MCPS CIP. We'll go through some summary information as well as some specific projects, but we're not expecting anything close to final decisions today, so rest assured we'll be revisiting this. And as we'll talk about a little bit more later, given the fiscal situation, we are expecting MCPS to return to us with some non-recommended reductions that Mr. Rice requested, consistent with what we've done in past years. So that will also have to be reviewed as well in the context of affordability as we go through the CIP. So this is really intended to give the committee a first look at the CIP and also to the degree you have questions that you want us to take back and bring back later this season, this is the time to do that as well. And we thought we would start this with, and we've done this also in the past, is have MCPS provide us with a summary of their CIP as well as the enrollment and demographic trends they're seeing. The enrollment in particular is a crucial measure with regard to their CIP and drives a lot of the decision-making and fiscal issues that we're dealing with. So I'd like to turn it over to MCPS and the board, and they should introduce themselves, of course, before we get started.
Excellent. So let me just start off by just a little bit of housekeeping. We were going to be also looking at the Public Arts Trust, but that has actually been postponed. We'll be doing that on March 9th. I did want to welcome our president of the Board of Education, Shebra Evans, our superintendent, Dr. Jack Smith, and then, of course, staff will be able to introduce themselves. I know who they are, but let's just go ahead down the line, and we can start with that. Let me just say that we also have a lot that's happening in Annapolis around school construction with the BUILD Act, and so from that perspective, we certainly hope that we'll see some secured funding come as a result. I know that OMB has been watching that as well in terms of trying to help with projections. There are a number of other bills that are also floating out there that may affect some of our ability to capture capital revenue as well as be able to leverage some of our revenue with bond funding from the state, things that we've been asking the state legislature for a long time for. So from that perspective, things are certainly moving in a positive direction. The reality is, and I just want to make sure that folks, for the millions that are watching at home, do understand, with this huge commitment that the state is looking at putting forth, it still barely scratches the surface when it comes to Montgomery County's share and the huge backlog of capital improvement projects that we need to just deal with some of our crumbling infrastructure and schools in our district and our neighborhoods, as well as when it comes to overcrowding as well. The reality is that decades of underfunding via the state is not going to be solved via this one bill in 1 year, nor in the process of a 10-year period. The reality is that we're still woefully short, far behind when it comes to ensuring that we're meeting the needs of all of our residents, not just here in Montgomery County, but throughout the state. And so from that perspective, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, but we certainly welcome and appreciate the start of getting us towards a more rational place when it comes to state funding for our school construction. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Smith or Ms. Evans.
So good morning, Chairman Rice and Councilmember Jawando, Councilmember Navarro. As stated, I am Shebra Evans, the president on the Montgomery County Board of Education, and I just want to really come here today to speak in support of our FY 2021 capital budget projects, as well as FY 2021 through 2026 capital improvements program. Montgomery County Public Schools, I will say, and thank you for the introduction that you gave to the listeners, the viewers today. Montgomery County Public Schools sought to make sure that we balance the fiscal constraints of the county with the needs that we're facing here in our school district, overcrowded schools, and just wanting to address the aging facilities and infrastructures that you mentioned as well. We have in this school year, 2019-2020, we get our official numbers in September at the end of the month, and at September 30th in 2019, we were at the mark of 165,200 and some odd students, and that was an increase of 2,500 students this year, and we could attribute that increase to our international student enrollment. We just wanted to let you know that that is causing the increase in our CIP requests as well as our operating budget requests too. Since our calendar year of 2009-2010, we have increased by 23,000 students. You'll hear me say that over and over again. I think that's really important for people to know. And then by the 2025-2026 school year, we expect to get additional 6,000 students, which will take us over 171,000 students enrolled in Montgomery County. That is a huge growth for any district in the nation to be able to accommodate, and we're trying to make certain that we do that in our requests through our CIP budget. I thought that was really important to make mention, and in the years past, our enrollment has really been impacted by our elementary schools. You've seen a lot of our construction projects happen in elementary schools, and now we're seeing that shift. That shift is going to our secondary schools, most importantly in the high schools. So we just really want to be proactive and making certain that in advance we're taking steps to address the overcapacity needs. And so in this CIP request, we have requested $1.8 billion for our construction projects, and as you stated earlier, it would address overcapacity as well as aging facilities that we have not been able to do around HVAC and PLAR. I just want to go ahead and I'm going to read aloud some of the projects that we have, the 25 projects that are included in the CIP. I want our viewers to know that we have made certain to include a lot of the schools that we see have space deficits. There are 6 approved addition projects at Cresthaven, Dufeef, Ronald McNair, Montgomery Knowles, Roscoe Nixon, Pinecrest. Those are elementary schools. There are 3 new additions at Bethesda, William Tyler Page, and Westbrook Elementary Schools. We have 2 previously approved new elementary schools, Clarksburg Cluster Elementary School number 9 and Gaithersburg Cluster Elementary School number 8. We have a new elementary school with expenditures in the out years of the CIP to address the overutilization in Bethesda Chevy Chase and Walter Johnson clusters. We have previously approved planning funds for 3 elementary schools, Lake Seneca, Highland View, and Thurgood Marshall Elementary Schools. And once planning is complete, and the construction funds will be considered in the future CIP. We also have previously approved addition projects at Parkland, Thomas W. Pyle, and Silver Spring International, and Tacoma Park Middle Schools, and 1 previously approved replacement project for Colonel E. Brookley. And we had 2 previously addition projects at the high school level, John F. Kennedy and Walt Whitman High School. 1 previously approved addition facility upgrade for Northwood High School, and the opening of a new school at the Crown Farm site. and the reopening of Woodward High School. So those 25 projects do not even include the 9 major capacity projects, which is Burnt Mills, South Lake, Stonegate, Woodland, those are the elementary schools. Neelsville is the middle school. At the high school level, it's Poolsville, Damascus, Wooten, and Magruder. Right? So we just wanted to state that for the record to let you know that those are the projects that we have included, the 25 capital projects as well as the 9 major capacity projects. And as it was stated, a lot of it is just projects that we haven't been able to get to in terms of our aging facilities. And we just wanted you to know that these are things that we need to take care of, and it's important, and you stated that earlier, Councilmember Rice, so we do appreciate that. And then finally, for the FY 2021, the state aid request is $110.4 million, and this figure is based on the current eligibility of projects approved by the County Council in May of 2019. So we want you to know that we are constantly working with our state legislators. Dr. Smith and I have been to Annapolis on several occasions to testify on behalf of the Build to Learn Act, right? And so we will continue to work with our state legislators as well as with you. I just want to thank you in advance for your support and for allowing us to come here today to speak to the needs of Montgomery County.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Evans. And let me just say that, I had an opportunity to talk this weekend, and one of the things that's incredibly important for us is about relationships. And I can tell you that our relationship between our school board, our superintendent, our state legislature has never been stronger. The reality is that we're communicating on so many levels and getting so many things done and so many things accomplished, and we're starting to see a tremendous push forward in terms of some of the things we've been asking for a very long time to come to fruition. The reality is that even with that happening, it still means that we can't do all that we want to do. And so it really presents a challenge. This council has been committed for years to continue to try and do all that we can, exceeding the charter limit when it comes to property taxes, to try and do our part, knowing that, the state wasn't able to do their part when it came to continuing to really try and get us out of the hole that we continue to find ourselves in. That's unfortunately not unique to Montgomery County. It's all across the state, across all 24 jurisdictions. And so it really is one in which, again, as I talk to some of my colleagues across the state, their dynamic is a little bit different in terms of that relationship. And so I really value the fact that while we know what we need to do, we also understand that we're not able to do all of those things that we need to do, and how best to strategize around doing what we can with what we have has always worked incredibly well. And so the thoughtfulness in being able to come back and let us know based on the projects that we have that are all incredibly important and are all valid, but there always has to be an order. And I always use the example of what happens when we haven't had an example of this as of recent, but when we plow our roads for snow, there's always a first and there's always a last. And the person who gets their road plowed last is not happy that they're last. But the reality is that there's always going to be a last person, right? We may be able to speed up the process and get them more constrained in terms of that window between the first and the last, but the reality is you're still last. Somebody's going to be last. And so the same thing applies here, to where while we know we want to get to those other roads, the reality is that some may take a little bit longer than others. But we're going to get to them. We're committed to that. We're committed to making those things happen. And I look at schools like a Poolsville, who've been waiting for a very long time, right? And now their card is there. And so it really is one of those where, again, for those millions that are watching at home, I want people to understand and see that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Even though it may seem as though there isn't, the reality is that it's there, and we're going to try and get to all of them. And the more money we have, the more constrained and the quicker we can get to that one that's at the last on the list, right? Doesn't mean they're less important. Doesn't mean but with limited resources, we can't do it all at the same time, right? And we can't do them all within the same 6-year CIP. And so from that perspective, I just hope that folks understand that and know that we are working together to try and get the best outcome we can for our school system, for our kids, for our teachers and building personnel who are all there in these buildings who are dealing with some of these challenging situations. So I just wanted to editorialize a little bit because I think it's important for folks to understand what it is that's at stake, what we're working towards, and how hard this is to really do. Dr. Smith.
Good morning, Jack Smith, Superintendent. I think your words, Councilmember Rice, are so on target in terms of the commitment of this community over decades to ensure that schools were provided. I think one thing that we all have to think about, and this is a tremendous attribution and compliment to the county council members for years, and that is, what would the community look like right now in terms of schools if we had added 23,000 students over the last 10 years and this council had not forward funded the building of schools? Because I can tell you, as someone who worked closely with the state construction program and actually chaired the IAC for a year, if you wait for IAC approval to build every building, we would be years behind where we are now. So on one hand, we gave you a very bold ask back on the beginning of December because the board members, the Board of Education members, and I were placed in our job to advocate for the school system. At the same time, we have to do that in the context of all the other needs in the community: health and human services, public safety, emergency services, libraries, roads and highways. All those things fit together. And so we would be remiss if we did not both acknowledge what's happened on behalf of the school system and understand that everything, as you say very well, cannot be done at the same time. And so the things we come before you to express today are all said within the context of that understanding. And I know in the 4 years I've been here, the council and the county government have been incredibly responsive. And so today we're prepared to answer any questions, go over anything that the analysts have seen in it that would we could clarify or provide additional information, and then move forward with what we can do. Because while this 6-year CIP is going forward, whole new sets of schools will be becoming future CIP projects, because every day passes and every day comes, and as you know, the school that seems like it was brand new yesterday, all of a sudden we look up and it's 15 years old. And we're talking about the roof or upgrades and the programmatic needs or whatever it is. So anyway, thank you very much for your support of public education and of facilities.
Excellent. I did want to turn to Ms. Beck from Office of Management and Budget to just give the county executive's perspective in terms of the budget that he sent over, constraints, give you an opportunity to talk about how the budget was framed from the county executive standpoint.
Right. Thank you very much. I think everybody at this point knows that the overall CIP had to be reduced. There was consensus that to preserve operating budget flexibility, the bonds needed to be reduced. So those, between PAYGO and bond reductions, those went down by just under $100 million over the 6-year period. We also had some reductions in impact taxes. So as a result, the tax-supported CIP had to decrease by 4.3%. The school's budget, as pointed out in Keith and Craig's packet, went down by 1.7%. I think representing the executive's interests that he knew the council shared in prioritizing education. I think the other thing that was a challenge with this submission as it came in, again reflecting the Board of Education's understanding of needs, was that it was incredibly front-loaded. And so in the first year of the CIP, there was like a $65 million increase, almost $100 million in the next 2 years, and then down to $58 million. We don't have a lot of flexibility to do that. We would have literally had to decimate level of effort projects, and I know the superintendent mentioned those things are important too to everybody. So I think where we've all been united is in trying to do everything we can to get more state aid. There's been a lot of coordination and conversation about the BUILD Act, trying to get it set up so that it is as favorable as possible for us. The current funding parameters between sort of our policies and practices and the IACs regulations have left us in a situation where we're getting 20 to 25% match. So literally, we have to spend $3 to $4 to get one state dollar. And so one of the concerns we've had with the new money is trying to make sure that that proportion changes significantly. And we've spent a lot of time with Adrian and Seth and council staff trying to work through some scenarios. And I think the BUILD Act is incredibly exciting. I think we all want to leverage that as best we can. I think one thing, though, that will be a sharp departure for us, we've been living in this forward-funded world, and we could just plug in a robotic number for state aid, and we could pretty much, as long as the state came through, we could find a way to apply it to projects. That will be more challenging going forward. Once we get to a point where we're no longer forward-funded, we will literally have to be going project by project and trying to do our best estimates of how much state aid we can get for those projects. I know Adrian will say it's a little scary to do that because it's speculative. We're speculating on costs, we're speculating on enrollment and how those things will go. But we will have to do that or we may leave ourselves with holes in the CIP going forward. So I think this year we will have to have sort of a mini working group with OMB, council staff, and the schools, literally taking the non-recommended prioritization and mapping some things out, some scenarios, so that we can see how the new state aid might pan out year by year, since we have to balance the CIP year by year. So I think it's going to be quite complicated, and I appreciate the work that's been done already with the schools, and I think there's more to come. So.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Councilmember Navarro. I've got a couple questions, and then I'll turn to Councilmember Jawanda. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to see everybody. Thank you so much, President Evans, for that overview, and Superintendent Smith. I really appreciated your comments regarding all that we have to do to serve our constituents, because at the end of the day, those children that leave the classroom and go into the community, go into households where they have to also rely on things like, affordable housing or transportation or access to health care. So it's all inclusive. And it's always been one of those interesting processes as we go through our budget deliberations, how to constantly keep that in mind. But I think you said it very well. This is a county that has always prioritized education. And in the past, we have had to make some, pretty courageous decisions, politically courageous, in my opinion, to prioritize education funding. And so in that sense, I think that the record is there, and we will continue to do everything possible to maintain those values. So I really appreciate that. And so as we're talking and going through this session, I would also welcome for you to talk about how you have worked towards innovative design, or any conversation that has taken place with possible co-location, because we have all these other policy areas like early care and education and things like that. Because it is, I think, important for the public to know that we're not static, and we don't just, sort of say this is our template and we're going to just do that forever. Because other jurisdictions around the country, as we all know, and this has been studied, have moved towards some other kind of innovative designs in order to leverage the dollars. So as we go into the conversation, if you could please share some of the shifts or the best practices that you're incorporating, and maybe some possible areas where you see some future collaboration for us to co-locate services in order to make that dollar stretch as much as possible. Councilmember Chairman Rice has said is so important. The reality is that even as we're working so diligently with our state partners, it's not going to be enough. And for a county like ours, I have to say it. I mean, we have had to stretch our dollars and prioritize over and over again to make this a priority. So it is a tough situation to be in sometimes, to be working so hard to advocate for more state dollars, and at the same time have to acknowledge that we've been doing that, and it's been tough because that's why we're in the hole that we are. So yeah, we welcome every single dollar, and we will be watching that matching, formula very closely, because, it's time that Montgomery County get its fair share, in light of also what we always talk about, which is the fact that, our student population is a student population that has a lot of needs. Yeah, and the percentages are what they are. They keep growing. The farms rate, the mobility rate, the ESOL rates, they keep growing. So it's an interesting time, but again, thank you so much for your leadership. And again, as we go through the CIP, if you could just share some instances where, there's been some interesting, I guess, work towards, whether it's procurement or whether it's design, or, whether there are areas where we can see some interesting innovation, so that we can get more bang for our buck as we go through. Thank you.
So I did want to ask a question and piggyback off of what Councilmember Navarro said. So I'm going to get, and Dr. Smith, Ms. Evans, I like to keep it real, and so I'm going to tell you that some of the criticism that we get, I think Seneca Valley High School is absolutely gorgeous. I drive by it quite a bit, right there in Germantown, and think that it's a beautiful school that represents a lot that the community has deserved for a very long time. But the criticism that we also get is that we're building Taj Mahals when we should be building school buildings that are appropriate for the work that needs to be done, understanding that we don't want to, cheapen the level of our school, but they feel as though sometimes we go above and beyond. Where's the happy medium? And have we found that balance yet? Are we still looking for it? What does that entail? And also, I know that at the state level, they're also looking at freeing up some of the requirements that are placed on our LEAs, our local education associations, when it comes to them actually having to deal with a lot of the requirements that actually drive up costs and mandate certain kinds of things that make school buildings look the way they do. So if you could, it's a lot that's kind of packed in there. But if you could give us your thoughts on that as we look at the CIP, that will be some of the criticism that's levied by some in our community.
So I think those are exactly the conversations we should be having in this community. How are we thinking with innovative and different ideas, and what exactly happens in a school? So let's start with Seneca Valley, for example. Several of us in this room stood on the football field a few years ago when they broke ground for that school, and a couple of weeks later, and I rarely say I, because it's always a team, and we have a team of 24,000 people in Montgomery County Public Schools and in this county government. But I think it was just because I was new, or relatively new, and I stepped back and said, we have a number of career and technology programs in the school already. Why wouldn't we make it a central hub as Edison is? And so when you look at that school, what you're seeing is a fully built out model of what Wheaton and Edison are at that school. And that's, I think, it was a shift in the way we thought about it. And to my, very positive reaction, the county government, the school board, everyone else said, of course, that's what we should do. Now we'll have students within 20 minutes of a program if they remain at their home school, or another innovation that we've done is begin to open up those schools so students can go there for the whole day. And that's a shift, and the board changed their policy, and everybody looked at it. In addition to that example of changing the way we think about how we do schools, we have co-located schools. Like we will have Tilden co-located school with special education, high levels of service, and regular education. We'll have a Maryvale co-located school. And I think those are shifts. And those things started before I came here, but that's what we want to continue to do. And those are kind of internal school things. When we look at the external, to Councilmember Navarro's question, we have innovative programs in Germantown and East County to help students who have either left school without a diploma or close to leaving school without a diploma. They're much more like going into a business. They're in commercial space. It's a very different experience, and it should be for a student who's 17 and can actually finish in a year and a half, but has no interest in sitting in one of our comprehensive high schools in 9th grade classes at 17. And so changing that way of thinking. So we have 3 such sites, 2 of them in commercial space. We have 1 of them in a formerly used school that's no longer used as a comprehensive school. We also have 2 early childhood centers that are not in schools that serve between 85 and 120 students in each one. And the difference in cost between opening those centers and building another wing on a school is profound. It saves money to use what we have now. And we'll be forwarding to you in the coming days a co-location commercial space proposal for Montgomery County Public Schools Central Services to get more efficiency, Kid Museum, and Early Learning all together in one space, and that will be in a space that does not require us to build something else. We ought to look at what we have. We have students on all 3 Montgomery College campuses right now. We've about increased 5-fold the number of students who are engaged with Montgomery County, and we're expanding that, and we're also expanding with our 4-year universities that want to partner with us. So we are moving toward an expansion with University of Maryland, Baltimore County to those. We have about 11,500 to 12,500 students per grade level cohort. There are so many students that need service, and there are so many different ways we can serve them. And then we're also exploring how we can create STEM and coding academies in our county using existing space so we don't have to build another building, and that will relieve some of the pressure on our high schools, but that will provide a pathway to an Associate of Arts degree, to a high wage skill set and knowledge base for students around computer science and coding. And we would very much like to have those up and running by school year after next to at least begin that effort. So a lot of things going on, and I think it's very exciting. The world has changed. Education must change with it. We absolutely have to. And we must think about our universal need to provide early learning services for many, many 3- and 4-year-olds. I think all is where we need to be. But we'll need space for those children both in the private sector and in the public school system. There is space here if we look at things with different eyes. So,
Well, Dr. Smith, I know you didn't do this on purpose, but it's just amazing how all of the boxes you checked are boxes that are not only priorities for this council, but are also a part of the Kerwin Commission recommendation. So that's pretty amazing how that happened, and it shows the thoughtfulness in the board and MCPS as a whole when it comes to thinking about how to prepare and make sure that we're doing our part before Kerwin even is passed. Should it pass? I assume it will pass, but it really talks about laying some of the groundwork. When you talk about CTE, you talk about those kinds of commitments that we're really trying to grow opportunities for in the county. We're already starting to do that and expand those opportunities for a lot of our children. When it comes to working with the early college access, that speaks to the college and career ready by grade 10. It's those kinds of concepts. When expansion of early childhood education, certainly one in which is encompassed in the Kerwin Commission recommendations as well. So it really is one where you're continuously seeing that work, that diligence that goes into the pre-planning and preparing for Kerwin Commission recommendations should they come from the state. So I really applaud both you and the board and MCPS as a whole for starting to think about those kinds of things and getting us ramped up. It's much easier to do it on the front end than the back end, which is what I've been telling our 24 jurisdictions for the past 3 years now. Just very quickly, and I'll turn to Councilmember Giwando. I do want to really put a finer point on the piece around some of the compliance issues that our schools deal with when it comes to stormwater management, when it comes to siting for energy conservation and LEED certification, all those kinds of things, because they add significant cost to projects. And it certainly is one where I think that, again, understanding what those are and the requirements that are, especially when it comes to elementary schools and play space. and the requirements that are there. Those are kinds of things that add significant costs to projects and limit the ability for us to place them in places where we actually own property and could have a better siting based on our preferences and based on the things that we evaluate where we're going to place schools. Can you talk a little bit about that and how, because I think we've made some strides. You know, one of your biggest criticisms from a lot of people in the community will be, well, the school system owns tons of space, tons of closed schools, and we never reopen schools. We never utilize, but now we're starting to see a lot of that actually happening. And we're starting to see us utilize a lot of those properties. So for those who criticized before, saying, oh, we never do it, we're actually doing it. And now it's all about what makes sense for us. So talk a little bit about that evaluative criteria that's there. Talk about some of the restrictions that are in place when it comes to that end up driving up costs.
Absolutely. It is a function of competing interests. As you very well know, all of you, but the residents may not know out there in the community as broadly. Montgomery County Public Schools closed about over 60 schools between the early 80s and the early 90s. And many of those schools sat empty or more likely became county government sites or other kinds of governmental agency sites or private schools. And so as you look at those, one of the priorities we've had in the last 3 years is to look at each one of those every time. That isn't always a positive conversation in the community because people who are inhabiting those sites don't necessarily like for them to be considered for a different use, for a school. But it is something that we have been aggressive at thinking and talking about. And also we've developed a very positive and close working relationship with the planning board and Mr. Anderson and all of the folks down there in Silver Spring, because that's an integral part of the conversation. And so that's, I think, a critical way forward is for us all to work together to look at the sites that exist. Sometimes, like when we talked at length about the holding school for Northwood, as they wait for a big renovation there that can't be done with students on site, we review a school closely and realize it would actually cost more to renovate the school to hold the students of Northwood than it would to build a new school. And so that's not good stewardship of the funds. But we just went through that process less than a year ago and looked deeply. We also looked deeply at 5 or 6 commercial sites, and in terms of space, utilization, and as you mentioned, the tremendous level of regulation. Schools are among the most regulated facilities in the state and nation, and should be. I'm not arguing with that. We also want to point out, and I would ask Seth and Adrian to speak to this, about our design and our energy efficiency. We need to be good stewards of the funds. We need to be good stewards of the environment. We need to be thinking about where students learn well. It doesn't have to be the Taj Mahal, but it can't be a cinder block building where you go in there and you feel like you've just been contained for a day every day of the week. That's not reasonable. We live in the 21st century, and a school cannot be profoundly different than a student's other experiences in the community and in their neighborhoods and those sorts of things. So it doesn't have to be particularly elegant or highly expensive, but it does have to be an environment that promotes a feeling of physical, social, and psychological well-being. And so that's a shift from the way schools were built historically, and it should be. And as we think about the classrooms, as we've looked at the new designs for Woodward and Northwest, much more flexible space, much more thoughtful approach to laboratories. So much is done now digitally rather than physically at the lab when you look at what's going on. Much more amenable to shifting and moving walls and rooms. And so many of those things are going on. So I would call on our team over here that has been deeply engaged in this conversation since I've been here to think about those things. Mr. Adams?
Dr. Smith, so thank you very much. For the record, Seth Adams, Department of Facilities Management Director, MCPS. I would say I think that's a great compliment to hear from our team, that folks think we're building Taj Mahals. They look like Taj Mahals, but they cost essentially builder grade. I mean, so that's something that we've been very proud of, is that we are one of the lowest cost builders in the Mid-Atlantic area with our schools. And folks have a perception that it's not. So I think that's a really good thing. And to piggyback off of what Dr. Smith has said, one of our primary goals is to create that sense of pride in the community, in the schools, and to focus on things that we know impact the student experience, as where we have felt that if you put your money towards that, you're gonna see great outcomes. You're gonna create a bond in that community. You're going to create a centerpiece in that community. If you can start to leverage other opportunities, whether partner with HHS, other partnerships with private folks, you really come up with win-win community projects. And that truly is our goal when we go into these. Some of the things that we're looking at, again, how do you save space? Thinking around virtual reality in classrooms, you don't necessarily have to have a very large space in order to teach things such as construction trades. You can condense those spaces. So we're looking at things like virtual reality, economies of scale. How do you do multiple projects within one essentially with $1 type of approach? We're going to open up this summer essentially newly built schools that we're building 2 schools that replace essentially 4. And, to be able to do that type of work and to stretch that dollars is certainly something we're very excited about. And you start to think about the new approach to the academic space. We spend a lot of time out in the communities, and we keep telling folks don't expect to see the same thing that you're used to seeing when you were in grade school or in high school. You're going to start to see different elements. You're going to start to see that kids learn differently today, that they have different experiences that need to be reflected in the classroom. Spending a lot of time working with our educators to make sure that the facility and the academics are truly a hand-in-hand model. Not something that we build it and hope that it works, but going into it with that thought that whatever space is there has to work today, tomorrow, 10 years, 20 years from now, and has to be flexible enough to adapt with the curriculum as it moves forward. But again, I think, for folks that we've heard that many times over about Taj Mahals, I think that is truly a compliment. And, we've been trying to show that our costs are very comparative to folks that are not building such great facilities that don't have things like daylight and acoustics and a warm, welcoming area to come every day, spaces for kids to hang out after school, to learn, to participate in after activities. We have those at the same cost of folks that don't. So I think it's a great compliment. And Seneca Valley is a true testament to that work that has gone into that.
Turn to Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Rice, and to my colleagues. It's good to see you all. And I know this is a difficult task to, when you have growing school system, a lot of challenges. Dr. Smith, you mentioned the closing school process that happened, earlier in our history. So I appreciate, want to start with, I appreciate how hard you all work to get this right, and with Mr. Adams, what you just said with the design team. Just a couple of questions related to the kind of high level. The major capital projects, right? So that you discussed, the 9, we're in this kind of this is the first time we've had this iteration of, with the, this type of process, scheduled through 26, and I know you have the initial list of schools. Embedded in the list that you read out, the 25 projects in the 9 cap, obviously there are other schools that are in need, right? We all acknowledge that. So, to Councilmember Rice's point, there has to be a sequencing, there has to be an order. We don't have unlimited funds. I did want to give you an example and allow you to talk about it in the context of the capital projects. So you have the listing of the schools there. Over the next several, up until FY26. And then there are some, schools, I was asking staff, such as like Eastern Middle School, for example, which we all know has needs. That is, I think, supposed to be in the next round of capital projects. Could you give me and the viewers a sense of how do we, so you anticipate you finish these in 26 and then you move on to those, or could you talk about that a little bit in the context of, in that KFI is going to change from year to year, things are going to break down, how the list might be adjusted? Could you talk about that?
Sure. The KFIs, the key facility indicators, were developed to help us get a better balance between capacity because of our tremendous growth and needs like schools like Eastern that you talked about. And how do we balance that so that we're not spending all of the resources we have available every year on just capacity? And that sounds like, how could you not meet all your capacity needs first? But if you do that, what you're going to do is have a very large backlog of schools that need tremendous levels of work. And so we're trying to balance those two things. And they do change slightly every year, the key facility indicators, because of looking at all the different areas. And I'll call on my two colleagues over here, the side, to talk about specifically. But anyone can go online and look at those key facility indicators for every school right now. And certainly sometimes when it's the amenities and the aesthetics of a school, people look and say, oh, well, this school looks really, old, or it looks really dilapidated. And we have to look at that and pay attention to that, because that goes to the students' sense of where they are and their pride, as Seth said. We also have to look, though, at structural problems, climate problems in terms of HVAC systems, leaks in roofs, and both the amenities of restrooms and cafeterias, but also their operability. Do they actually do what they're supposed to do in terms of removing wastewater and making sure that everything is done with the utmost attention to the environment? So all of those things come into play, and each year, starting now and going up until next December 1st, when we submit the next CIP to you, all of that is looked at again for all the schools that are currently in and work is being done, the ones that are in planning, the ones, like you say, Eastern, that are right there up against the next set of work to be done. And then looking out, we try and look 10 and 15 years out as we think about utilization and future big projects, either for capacity or the amenities of the school and the functionality of the school. So, Mr. Adams and Ms. Karamihas, if you have other things you can.
Sure. So thank you, Dr. Smith. So I think one of the things that really stood out to us during that key facility indicator process was, if you really break down the measurement of all your infrastructure in a school, you sort of have these two categories: the behind the scenes, behind the walls infrastructure, and then essentially that infrastructure everyone can see when they walk into schools, and that's your paint, your finishes, your casework, floors, ceilings. What we started to see as a theme in our evaluation is a lot of the schools that you heard some of the complaints about had very significant backlogs in the visuals. A lot of backlogs in the paint, in the doors, the windows. But some of those schools had pretty good infrastructure behind the walls, types of equipment that was ready to do its purpose. So moving forward, we're looking at this KFI as a balance. We're also looking at it as how can you look at a school like an Eastern, where you can potentially to do some interim steps, paint, furniture, casework, that are going to have high impact but relatively low cost. So how do you leverage that work, as well as when you look at schools like a Southlake? There's really no amount of paint that's going to fix that problem. There's the deep infrastructure elements that you have to go in and fix. So for us, it's trying to find that balance. We're not going to forget about the schools like Eastern, Piney Branch, Damascus Elementary, or Fox Chapel Elementary. We're not going to forget about those schools, but if there's ways to do continual improvement until we get to a point where we can do a much deeper systemic or building renovation project, we're going to do a little bit of both. So we've been working with folks like Eastern to go in and work on the program spaces and some of the finishes, just to make sure the community understands that we're not forgetting about you. We're not pushing you to the back of the line. We're going to be here. We're going to be here working on your issues. And we're also going to program this in future CIPs as well. So we feel very good that this KFI process is allowing us to do a combination of all.
I appreciate that, and like Councilman Rice just said something I was thinking, that's a great answer. I think when we hear a lot, as you can imagine, because, look, we all have kids in the school system or had them in, you know, like this is bad, or this is, and I think, if the foundation's cracked or if there's some sort of heating, you have to weigh things. But you also have to think of state of mind of students, and that's where those types of projects in the middle of a CIP project, if you're not on the list, and it's great to hear you say that you guys are working on those types of things, because I think that makes a big deal while you look to the larger replacements or renovations down the line. So that, I think that was really helpful. The other plug I wanted to make was related to ADA, and just get an update on how that's coming along and where you see that going. I think if I looked at the, as one of the countywide projects, you've got that steady 1.2 every year that you're requesting, and just a little update. And then you can also combine that with, as you're building new facilities, now that we're in this mindfulness, Be Well 365, extended day, extended year, some of these other programs, are you factoring that in? And if so, could you talk about how you're doing that into new facilities or renovations that you're doing?
The answer is yes. We're factoring all of those pieces in. And as we think about, for example, another way that we're rethinking how we do work is when the new Seneca Valley opens, it will have a community health center in it. And as we look at major renovations, additions, Kennedy, they will maintain theirs. And as we shift things, it's just so important that we think about those sorts of supports for students as we build out the schools. And I will have, once again, Seth and or Adrian talk about that. I could, but they can talk from the technical end as well as the legal and aesthetic end of making sure that things work together, about how we think about that. We're very concerned about it, but once again, we've seen a lot of changes in our society, but we have not changed entirely in our society, and schools are part of the society. And so we care deeply and worry about it, and we can't always change things until we really, really begin to do some significant changes to a school. So once again, Seth and Adrian.
So really important questions that you asked. I mean, particularly when you talk about ADA. I think ADA is one of those elements that we have done a deep dive. We did an analysis of every school facility to get a really good understanding of where we stand in terms of compliance with ADA. But we've also found that just because you comply with the Department of Justice doesn't necessarily mean you're meeting the needs of all your students. So we're trying to work through how to prioritize really both, but ideally we want to hone in on the individual student side, understand their experiences, make sure they have access, like all their peers, to all the elements of schools, and it is something we're gonna leverage that information that we have now to partner with the county. One of the things we've also heard is that there really hasn't been a great way for folks to share concerns around ADA challenges. So that's one of the things. How do you communicate in a way that folks can give us their feedback? We can provide our feedback on timing of projects, where we are going to focus in certain areas of ADA compliance. But definitely something that, as Dr. Smith said, a change in mindset, a change in approach. It has historically been this. Or do you comply with sort of this check box type of approach? But now we're changing our philosophy. We're trying to understand how it impacts each and every student. And things around year-round school, I think, even back to the KFIs, we one of the things that we look at are how quickly are systems sort of degrading? Are they staying on a linear curve that is within industry standards? Schools, you have to think, were built to have some resting periods in there. They were built to be able to go in the summer and to do some work.
Older schools,
not new schools. Older schools were built around that resting period. Our schools, however, not only are we looking at more year-round comprehensive models, but even the community use that are in our schools. I think our schools are open from 6:30 in the morning all the way up till midnight sometimes. And that's a considerable amount of use on a building. And it's something that, again, getting back to school construction, when you start to think about infrastructure replacements or building replacements, it's not just this approach of let's just build a school and walk away. We're building community centers that have to hold up to that wear and tear, and then have the ability for us to come in and do those constant upgrades without really impacting operations and those sorts of things. So we do put a lot of thought into how to manage those types of challenges, but it is something that we do and have very much also a background on.
Yeah, and on the ADA, I mean, as the projects, I think that's a great tool on the communication. I think that I've heard that as well. How do I make recommendations, or if I've had an issue? And obviously, as you're developing that, for us to know what those vehicles or processes would be helpful. And assuming from the steady funding, you think you have enough in this CIP to do what you need to do for the projects that you have upcoming. I'm not asking you to increase your requests or anything, but I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. So,
You saw Dr.
yeah, going for the button.
Light up.
Going
They're
for the
like,
button.
wait a minute.
Good. Thank you very much.
Let me turn to Councilmember Navarro for a follow-up.
Yeah, just a very quick comment, but Mr. Adams, when you were talking about, really adapting to the way our students learn today, right, in 21st century, it just reminded me as I just returned from Seattle visiting my daughter who works at Microsoft, and spent some time in one of her buildings in the lobby just working on some things while she was in a meeting, and then just kind of observing. It was clear that especially the younger employees, this whole notion of everybody works in a team, everybody works in flexible space, nobody necessarily sits at a desk, you kind of work wherever you are. It just really reminded me of the need that we have to prepare our students for that kind of workspace, right? And so it was very interesting because I could even see the generational difference between the way older employees were kind of behaving and the younger ones, and it's just very fascinating how fluid the concept of workspace is. And so the more that we can create that kind of environment for our students, I think the better off they're going to be once they go into the workplace. So it was just very fascinating to sit there and kind of do a little almost like informal research on just the way our young people and very proud of MCPS students who are out there doing really amazing things as well. Yeah, thanks.
So I think that we're going to go ahead and view some of the presentation. For folks that are wondering, well, why did we spend the past hour going over this? This is incredibly important. I mean, this is really, really important for us to have the background and understanding of why it is that we're doing this, why we spend so much time on this, how hard and difficult it is, bringing up all the great points about the things that we still need to do and the things that we're now thinking about very innovatively. All of that is stuff that I promise you a lot of people don't know. Just as, I just heard as I was driving in this morning, 70% of Marylanders who replied to the recent Goucher poll don't even know what Kerwin is. 70% of Marylanders. That says a lot. And it says that folks don't understand when they hear, well, you're spending all this money on school construction. You're building Taj Mahals. You're not making things ADA compliant. You're not doing this. You're doing this. It's like, it's important for us to have these conversations, these in-depth conversations about what folks are thinking, right? About what our new methodology is, how it is that we're trying to address the issues that we're seeing in our community, understanding that at the same time, and I thought of another way to kind of explain what you're talking about in terms of the folks that are waiting. So you're waiting in line to get into the concert, and people are getting in and being able to be seated, and you're still out there waiting in line, but somebody's actually bringing you a drink of water because it's hot outside. So again, it's not the same as you get to sit down, you're still not in yet, but at least we're doing something to try and help you while you're waiting, right? And so it's those kinds of things that I think folks need to hear and understand that we're thinking about. It's not just that we've forgotten about you and, well, you're not in the stadium yet, so that's too bad. But it is that we're trying to do something for you, understanding that, yes, we know that it's not the best situation you find yourself in, so let us try and do a little something for you. right? Those are the kinds of things that I think folks need to hear and understand so that they know they're not forgotten, that they're a part of this mix too, and that we're committed to still try and do whatever we can to alleviate some of the challenges that they continue to face. So turn it over to you for the presentation. Ms. Karamias.
It's my turn now.
Your turn, all right.
I'm just, I'm Adrian Karamihas. I'm the Director of Capital Planning from CPS. So I'm going to go through this presentation. A lot of what is in here, the slides were referenced by Mrs. Evans, but you'll see them in sort of a visual form so we can discuss them. So here is our enrollment. The second column, the official last year's enrollment was 162,680. Our official enrollment, the September 30th, as Mrs. Evans referred to, is 165,267, which is an increase of 2,587 students.
Adrian, and since September 30th, we've added just under 1,000 more students. So we're at 166,200. So getting to that 170 probably isn't going to take until 2025 if things keep going the way they
I
are.
feel like we need real-time updates because we all use this number a lot, and
Yeah.
so 166, what?
200.
200 is where we are today.
166, 267.
So we can do that. We can send you monthly updates.
No, I'm being serious. I think it will be helpful because I think
So
we
do I.
all use that number. And
We'll send you a monthly update each month to all of your staff members so they will have it for you. And to the county executive's office too.
And so again, if we look at these numbers where we're growing, we talked about again at the secondary level, you can see the 9 to 12 is an increase of a little over 1,000 students, 6-8, same thing. And you can see at the K2 3-5, you're talking about an increase of about 100 or so students. We're seeing that little dip in the K-5 enrollment. However, that's attributable to the decline in births. But we are back on the increase of births, and so there will be just this short lull before we see that K-5 number coming up again, just as we have seen that in the past.
Yeah, it's very interesting just to quickly comment on that because my daughters who are now in that space, we've got an 8th grader and a 12th grader, but they were a part of that huge bubble that was that K through 12, that was that huge gigantic spike where you had schools that were elementary schools that had 1,100 students in them, right, that are now at 700, right? And so it's that bubble. So that's what Councilmember Juanda and I were talking about. So now that bubble has started to go towards the end of the hose, and it's about to start back up again. So we see that cycle all the time.
Another way to look at it over the years, we say on average we've grown about 2,500 students, which you can see. We did have an anomaly last year. We did have that growth of about 1,100 students, and part of that we always say is where we're located, the area, government regulations, laws that could affect our enrollment. That certainly is attributable to last year's decline. But we are back on track to over 2,500 students, and for the foreseeable future, we see that growth continuing at about 2,500 students. Again, another way to look at it, over the 10-year period, we were about 144,000 students. Back in 2010, we're at 166 for now, but the official at 165, so that increased growth of over 2,100 students over that 10-year period. And again, that line continuing to grow. Here's just a comparison of actual versus projected. Again, we talked about being almost at 171, almost 172,000 students. You can see, again, the blue line is the elementary line. So we're currently at 72,000 students. That we will have that small dip over the course of the next 6 years. At the middle school and high school level, middle school's at the orange line, high school is that purple line. You can see at the high school level, it's about a 5,000 student increase over the next 6 years, and the middle school level, a little more than or a little less than 2,000 kids, but the total, and I think it was referred to, about 6,000 students over the next 6 years, and that's what the projection is. Each year, and we talk about this, our enrollment projections change each year in the fall, so that number clearly can change over the course of the next few years, and so we will be watching that. again, what our student population by race and ethnicity. The top line is the white non-Hispanic line. You could see back in 2000, it was about 65,000 students, and we are down to about 44,000 students. The Hispanic population, our Hispanic student population, starting at about 21,000 students in 2000, has more than doubled. We are at 53,000, almost 54,000 students. Our African American student population, again, growth there, not nearly as much as the Hispanic population, and the Asian, also that growth you can see from about 18,000 students to about 23. In 2010, you could see the dip in all of that. That was attributable to students identifying as 2 or more races. So we do have that enrollment, student enrollment number as well. Okay. We talked a little bit about free and reduced meals. Our county is changing and continues to change over time. In 2010, we had about 44,000 students eligible for free and reduced meals. We are now up to about almost 56,000 students. That's an increase of almost 12,000 students. I present this data at different events, and one of the things that people see and are so surprised at, of those almost 56,000 students that are eligible for free and reduced meals, 79% of those 55,000 students are actually eligible for free meals. And that's a huge number. Okay.
And what's that level for people watching? So could you explain the difference between the two?
So it goes by, and it's a federal, and if anybody knows this better than me, it is a federal number, and it is a household, a family of 4. And if you are below that household number, we can get the actual for this year. I want to say it's in the 20s.
It wasn't. I wasn't trying to stump you.
Oh, that's okay.
It's a very low number.
It is a very low number for a
close to federal
household of
poverty.
yes. And if you are below that number, then you are eligible actually for the free part of the free and reduced meals.
It's about $30,000 of family income that makes you, or lower, that makes you eligible. And if you receive reduced price meals, it's about 40 cents. The state of Maryland is going to do away with reduced meals as a factor and make them all free, and I think that is in 2021. That will shift. And the other thing that's important to note about this is we know that this number is underreported because we have a large number of families who are not willing to engage with governmental forms and providing information. And we're very conscious of that and pay close attention to that in our schools because our priority is the physical, social, and psychological well-being of children. So we make sure that in any way, shape, or form that we can, we provide for them.
If I can just jump in there, Dr. Smith, because one of the conversations that a lot of folks have been having is that with the large growth that we continue to see in free meals, free and reduced meals, but and the level at which folks are qualifying for free, at some point it makes sense to just not even have the forms altogether and to just provide the service, which ties into capital, because it does make sure that we're also mindful of the fact that in the morning we will have a larger number of students who will be taking advantage of the free breakfast in the morning, especially. That's one piece of it that ties to a lot of our current commission recommendations that are the resources for some of our students that are at risk at promise. And so from that perspective, there's a lot more conversation around this that's happening that I think in the coming years from the state perspective, folks are already talking about what this may look like. We talked about it briefly at Kerwin and talked about that as well because we said, well, if we're already seeing these huge increases, I mean, we've got schools where the whole school would basically qualify for free breakfast and free lunch anyway. So in those cases, I mean, there's also the conversation about the stigma, and we've tried to do away with that with just having it on the account, so kudos to MCPS for doing that. But I mean, at some point, it's where it's like, why don't we just do this knowing that it's a positive thing for all of our kids to have these high quality meals now that we have too, because there's been a lot of work in making the meals, although our kids, look, you can't please your kids. I mean,
It's just not possible, trust me. As father of 2 daughters, one who's a vegetarian, one who's a cheeseburger-tarian, there is no way to satisfy them. But all that being said, I think that what we provide our kids is incredible in terms of nutritional value, all those kinds of things. And so from that perspective, it really would make sense for us to head in that direction. So.
There actually is a program right now in the system called the Universal Eligibility Program, and we do serve a handful of schools, 8 to 10 schools, with that kind of universal philosophy. And we'll send a written briefing on that program. I just had one recently from our staff, Dr. Zuckerman and Ms. Dawson and others, and it really is very good information, and we're constantly watching where is the point at which we should just move to universal services. So we'll send you a written briefing on that so that you have the up-to-date information.
Thank you for that. All right. Sorry, Ms. Karamias.
I know my daughter eats breakfast twice because she likes, because my account, I get the notice that my account's low. I'm like, how's it low? I just put money in there. But anyway, so she at least likes it. One of them.
And so looking at our ESOL population, which definitely reflects the students that are in our schools now, again, looking back in 2010, you can see the student population across elementary, middle school, and high school. And again, where we are today, it's an increase of about 10,500 students who are getting some type of ESOL services at the various school levels at MCPS. So going into the board's request, again, Ms. Evans referenced this. The board's request is $1.818 billion for the 6-year CIP. It is an increase of $74.2 million over the approved CIP. It does address many critical capacity and aging infrastructure needs. Those are both our capital projects and our major capital projects as well. It includes, again, a total of 25 capacity projects, and you can see where that is at the different levels. At the elementary schools, it's 9 additions, 3 new schools, and funding for 3 additions. At the middle school level, it's funding for 5 additions, and at the high school level, it's funding for 3 additions and 2 new schools. And again, just to look at that, the bold projects are the ones that are new to the board's requested CIP. So you could see all of those elementary school projects, the middle school and high school projects as well. Here are our new schools, the 3 at the elementary school and 2 at the high schools. And we talk about the revitalization expansion program, which is finishing up. We are sort of in that new phase, as was referred to through our major capital projects, but these are the 5 projects that are finishing up now. We talked about 2 co-locations. I think Dr. Smith referred to these. Maryvale and Sandburg is one of our co-locations at the elementary school level. And at the middle school level, it's Tilden Middle School and Rock Terrace School is the other one. In addition to, of course, Seneca Valley and the CTE program that's going to be there as well. And our major capital projects, here are the 9s with the completion dates, the 4 elementary schools, 1 middle school, and the 4 high schools. So we talk about seats. So what do all those projects get us? So you could see at the elementary school level, the total added capacity is almost 4,000 seats. At the middle school level, we're at about 2,000 seats. And at the high school level, about 8,000 seats for a total of 14,219 seats. These seats do not reflect the major capital projects. Part of the process with the major capital projects is looking at those schools individually, what their needs are from a programmatic perspective, a capacity perspective, and an infrastructure perspective. So as we go through those scopes of work and those programmatic requirements, we will then know where we are with the seats. And so I anticipate next year when we do this again, we will have all of those included in our additional capacity to be completed. And people do ask, so how is our CIP divided by sort of our groups of projects? We have individual capacity projects, county-wide, the major capital projects, and then the end of the revitalization expansion projects. So you can see from a capacity project, capacity still is our largest bucket of projects at 41%. Our major capital projects, which is our new process moving forward, is about 22%. Our county-wides, which includes so much of our systemic work, our HVAC replacement, roof, what we refer to as PLAR, which is our Plan Life Cycle Asset Replacement Projects, which is everything inside the building that goes, floors, doors, all of those painting, all of those items are in that PLAR project. So our countywide projects, ADA is another one under our countywide, is about 30%, and then our RevX, finishing up our RevX projects, is about 7% of the CIP. And this is over the 6 years, not the 1 year, but this is over the 6 years. And that is it.
Let me turn back to our staff. Thank you very much for that. That's a great, again, kind of 10,000-foot view when it comes to what it is that we're focused on, what it is that we need to pay attention to when it comes to addressing some of the needs. I think one of the slides that was most striking is about the number of seats that we're growing as a result of these projects. Because, again, as we talk about added capacity, as we talk about folks who are struggling, as we talk about even in our economic development opportunities and folks that are in moratorium in certain areas and being able to allow them to continue to build, because we have the conversation around making sure that we're going to meet our affordable housing goals, that also ties when it comes to school capacity and making sure that school capacity is what it needs to be while we're allowing for us to continue to expand affordable housing opportunities. And so from that perspective, I think it's very exciting to see just those amounts quantified in black and white. That's a very telling statistic. So let me turn to staff to kind of walk us through some of the other points that we need to pay special attention to.
Yeah, there are a few other items we can cover in the packet. You just referenced the subdivision staging policy, and I have a write-up on that starting on page 3, starting with where we stand with the FY20 test that we did last year. And just to remind folks, the SSP includes a look at the last year of the CIP's enrollment projection. So year 6, and this for last year it was FY25. Next year it'll be FY26. And it looks at cluster-wide utilization. So all 25 high school clusters are tested. And it also has a test for all of the specific middle and elementary school areas as well. And you could fail one, either, or both. If you fail one of them, then that area or that cluster is in moratorium. And that could be at the elementary, middle, or high school level. There are different ways to avoid moratorium. Obviously, if there's a project moving forward, it gets counted in the capacity calculations, and you would avoid a moratorium that way. But also, there are some cases where we can do solution projects, where we know a project is perhaps in facility planning and can be built in time to affect the enrollment and capacity projections in year 6. Then the council can choose, it does not have to, but it could choose to fund a solution project, which is a placeholder project, until a real project comes forward. In fact, we have several examples of that this year. But just to reference the FY20 test, on page 4 of the packet, I've noted the 4 school clusters and the 13 individual school assignment areas, which are currently under moratorium. And a couple of other clusters would have been in moratorium, but for some projects that allowed space to be counted for them and explicitly included as references in the project description forms. So there's a number of areas, and what this points to really is that all that enrollment growth you've seen in the earlier slides hits home in these areas. These are areas that are experiencing not just 105% growth, but 120% overutilization in year 6. Now, the good news is in most of these cases, there are projects that are at some level of concept. Perhaps some are going to move forward, even in time for the upcoming year. So a lot of these projects already were being looked at by the school system to figure out how can we address the overutilization, not because of the SSP, but because they're trying to get to a reasonable utilization level at their schools for their educational purposes. But in the approved CIP, the council did approve 3 solution projects. the Bethesda Elementary School solution, Somerset Elementary School solution, and the Francis Scott Key Middle School solution. These are noted on page 5 of the packet. And I've noted here what would happen if we were looking at the current enrollment projections that just came out as part of the new CIP. Would these solution projects still be needed? And you can see the Bethesda Elementary School solution without without the placeholder project, but with the new projections, it would be at 131.4% utilization rate. So there's an issue there. So coincidentally, not coincidentally, the Board of Education has proposed a addition project for that, an actual addition project for that school. So the solution project will go away. The addition project is now in the proposed CIP. But, of course, we have affordability issues. So that's something we have to look at when we look at the non-recommended reductions that come back, when we look at the state aid that we discussed earlier. How does that all balance? Arguably, the Bethesda Elementary School project is a fairly high-level, important project given its high utilization. But we have to look at this in the context of all of the projects that may be up in the air at this point. Somerset Elementary School, another issue, we have 115%, not quite as high as Bethesda, but still significant overutilization at Somerset. And the board has proposed a addition project at Westbrook Elementary School to address Somerset, because Somerset is a very tight site, and ultimately they decided it was not feasible or not desirable at least, or perhaps even economical, to put an addition on that site and solve it with a nearby addition and then a school assignment change. And then the Key Middle School solution, once again, some overutilization there without the placeholder. The board is recommending removing that solution project and monitoring that enrollment and deciding what may need to happen in the future with that school. And this is the kind of exercise that has to happen every year. Projects that are either in moratorium or or schools that are in moratorium or on the edge of moratorium, solution projects that may lead to new projects in many cases, or in some cases, if the enrollment does change significantly, perhaps it can be revisited. But that's something we have to do every year. Now, of course, with the board's proposal, we have a new set of capacity and utilization to look at. And that's part of the FY21 test, and that write-up starts on page 5 of this memo. And as proposed, I've noted here that under the board's proposal, no clusters would fail the FY21 SSP test. And that's not surprising given that we have, for instance, Woodward and Crown, which were just outside the test last year, moving into the test period this year. So the capacities associated with those high schools are now within the test. So not surprisingly, some of those areas that were problematic last year are not here. However, even with all of the schools that have moved into that area, you still have 3 elementary school areas and 1 middle school service area that would go into moratorium. I've listed them at the bottom. Highland View Elementary School, Mill Creek Town Elementary School, Judith A. Resnick, and Argyle Middle School. Now, in this case, what we do is, obviously, we look at the significance of the over-enrollment there. We also look at what development may or may not be happening in those areas and decide, does the school system have plans or any projects sort of in the works, in the hopper, that may ultimately be in place by the end of the 6 years. If any of that is possible, then we might consider a solution project here. However, if any of those things are not likely, especially if there's no plans for any additional capacity in that area, then we would not move forward with a solution project because it's not likely to happen. And projects may just ultimately end up in moratorium. Now, complicating the issue this year, as we mentioned, is the potential non-recommended reductions that may come back to, or that will be coming back to the council. The planning department staff did an excellent review of all of the new and ongoing projects in the board's proposed CIP, and I've attached their analysis to this packet. And they look at the implications of any delays in those projects. And as you can imagine, any project that is pushed beyond the test period is going to affect the capacity review. In some cases, that may push something into moratorium. And so that's the kind of exercise that we're going to go through when we review the non-recommended reductions that come back. What are the implications on the SSP test, as well as obviously the implications more generally in terms of priorities we have for the MCPS CIP. But I did want the committee to have a general sense of where we stand with the current test or with the approved test and the current test, and that is a work in progress, and we'll be bringing the results of that back to you once we get the non-recommended reductions back from the schools.
Can I just ask a question there? When are we slated to get those?
We had asked for the non-recommended reductions back by March 12th.
Okay.
We have a committee session tentatively set up, I believe, for March 26th.
Okay.
Well, it might have been moved to the 30th. I've got to look and see what the latest calendar says there. But by the end of March, the committee will be back, and we'll be able to look at these non-recommended reductions and provide some perspective on the utilization issues at a lot of these schools and the choices the school system made in terms of what projects it noted in its non-recommended reductions to defer and what maybe it decided to keep on schedule, and the committee can have that discussion with them.
Excellent.
If you're done with that, we can move on briefly to the fiscal summary. We talked about this earlier. I just wanted to highlight the executive's recommendation. We have Ms. Beck was here earlier. Oh, Veronica's here. And this gets to the affordability issue. Table 2 on the bottom of page 6 notes the amended CIP, the board's request, and the executive's recommendation. And the executive's recommendation is very important because it balances within the council's spending affordability guidelines. So that, not so much the individual recommendations in the executive's recommendation, but the fact that the CIP balances, that becomes the baseline for the council's review, the January to May review that we have. So anything the council adds has to be offset by something else, either increased revenues or reduced areas elsewhere in the CIP in order to balance within those SAG recommendations. And the executive's recommendation, as noted here, I provided the differences from the executive's recommendation and the board's request. And it is about $103 million difference over 6 years, $104 million, which is significant, but even more important than that is, as Ms. Beck mentioned earlier, the board's proposal was heavily front-loaded, and the executive's recommendation is not. So you have large numbers in those first 4 years. The 61 million you see at the bottom of FY21, 92, almost 93 million in 92, but similar in 23, and then a little lower in 24. Those numbers add up to big change. So that is going to be the challenge, not just the total 6-year change, but balancing each year. And even with the state aid that we're talking about, and by the way, that state aid, the new state aid would not kick in until FY22, not FY21. Even with that new state aid, we're still going to have to figure out how to balance those early years. And in some cases, because we have some capacity in 25 and 26, I imagine we're going to see a lot of projects shifting some of their expenditures and their completion dates into 25 and 26, inevitably, just to make the numbers work. But exactly which projects those will be, we don't know yet. And how much state aid we can plug into these different years, we don't know that yet either. In terms of, real quickly, the executive's actual recommendations, I've noted them on page 7 of the packet. And as we've talked about in past years, much of what the executive does is an affordability and a funding reconciliation at the macro level. He identifies how much can be provided to the school system, and for the most part, does not allocate or does not recommend how to make those numbers work. There were some technical adjustments the executive recommended in a number of projects in FY20 and one to Pyle Middle School in FY21, which the school system concurred with. So we will accommodate those into our capital planning here. But for the most part, we're looking at an affordability exercise that came from the executive and not individual project recommendations that we can work off of. And that's one of the major reasons why we asked the school system to provide their perspective on how to get to the executive's numbers, because right now we don't have that roadmap for how you would get there. I think I won't belabor the state aid we've talked about already. What I did want to mention with regard to the schools projects themselves, we've broken them up into the individual school projects and then the county-wide projects. And I'll talk first about the individual projects at a pretty broad level, and then Mr. Howard will talk about the county-wides. The individual school projects on page 11, I break down in three major categories. I have new projects. And these aren't just new schools. These could be new addition projects. So not to confuse you, but new projects that are not currently in the amended CIP. And then we have approved individual school projects, which are either under construction or not yet under construction. And I think that's important too, because once a project is under construction, you've got to have a very good reason to pull the plug on that. Those projects are almost always going to be your highest priority to finish them up. And I've noted in each of these categories going ahead, I've noted each project, the cost per year for those projects, and the opening date for those projects, so you can get a sense of what we may see with the non-recommended reductions that come back. Obviously, with the new individual school projects I mentioned earlier, like Bethesda Elementary School Addition, it doesn't exist yet in the CIP. It's requested because there was a solution project, which obviously indicated a major capacity issue. The school system is trying to address that capacity issue in here, so it shows up as a new project. It would actually complete in September 2023. You've got several other new projects listed as well, but you can see they're generally front-loaded in the CIP. This is a front-loading that Ms. Beck mentioned earlier. And whether we can afford it on these schedules is going to be a good question. There is some leeway from an SSP standpoint, not from a, do we want to fill up our school standpoint, but from an SSP standpoint, you have a couple of years of flexibility. Not that that's driving necessarily the train here, but from an SSP standpoint, there's some flexibility.
So I wanted to ask, because there's been some conversation about the front loading of the CIP. I know one of the answers is going to be that I know that we're concerned about construction costs, and construction costs are continually going up. And so from that perspective, having them done earlier rather than later certainly benefits us from a cost containment perspective. But what else was associated with some of the front loading when it came to why it was you structured the CIP the way you did?
The number of large projects in this particular 6 years. And Ms. Kiermihas can give some specifics to that, but that's also going to affect, as Glenn said, what we do with non-recommended reductions, because there's just some very large projects all in this CIP together.
So, and to clarify, there are only a handful of new projects. So the projects that are in the CIP actually maintain their completion dates, and after a 2-year biennial, it's where they fell as of last year's. And I think that this was referred to, we talked about, I don't know if it's in our CIP or during our presentation to the board, there are a lot of big projects, but they fall sort of where they fall. So those projects, for example, in Northwood, a Crown, and a Woodward, that are very large projects, we didn't accelerate them from 2 years ago. They just are where they are in the CIP. And looking at the new projects, and we talk about this too, the new projects that bring to the beginning of the CIP are really planning funds. It's those projects that are now either ready for construction or will be within the 2 years. That's where the big expenditures are. And again, those projects were already in the approved CIP, and their schedule just remains where they are.
I think that's an incredibly important point, and one in which that's why I wanted to hone in on it a bit, because we've said it a number of times about front loading. The reality is it's just that's where they ended up falling. Now, while it's perceived as being front-loaded, the reality is what we should be saying is we have a large number of projects that actually are falling in this. But front-loaded to me means more of intentional, trying to put it there, which is why I asked the question, was there something different that I didn't know about that was some sort of strategy? It wasn't that at all. It was just that they ended up being there. And so from that perspective, I think that'll be helpful, especially for our colleagues when we're starting to deliberate around this and deliberate around our CIP, is understanding this is just keeping consistent with the schedule of previously approved CIPs, and that's why the numbers are the way they are.
Well, also, it probably meant that in previous CIPs, we were looking at the spread, and coincidentally now they're all coming due to, to the construction time, so.
And
So-
I think the CIP in general, you're going to have more certainty about what needs to happen in the first few years than you will in the last few. I think it's natural for the CIP to be front-loaded unintentionally. The numbers are front-loaded. That's not to say there was some intent to put certain numbers in certain years. And certainly with the new projects, they're going to have planning and design the first couple of years, so they don't hit real hard until those third and fourth years. Although I mentioned earlier, even the third and fourth years are very tight under the executive's recommendation. So the new projects may ultimately have to be part of that solution, given the years 3 and 4 are also tight. But I did want to move on to the next category, which is the individual school projects that are under construction. That's on page 12 of the packet. And you've got 8 schools. 4 of them actually have the same total project cost as assumed in the amended CIP. 4 projects actually have some cost increases. And we can talk more about those, but my assumption is that even with those cost increases, these are still going to be high priorities to move forward, because it's just too disruptive to stop construction and come back, or try to change the scope of a project late in the process. But just wanted to highlight that for you. And once again, obviously they're under construction, so they're hitting those first couple years. It's not intentional, that's just the schedule they're on. Then you have the projects that are not under construction. This is the majority of the individual school projects in the CIP. They're on page 13 of the packet. And you can see a lot of the numbers here for addition projects. That's most of this. But you also have the Woodward High School reopening and the Northwood High School addition facility upgrade. Those are hitting here, and of course Crown. So those are all in these numbers. They're not under construction yet, so you don't have the complication of trying to manipulate the project after it's under construction. But as you can see, they all have spending in FY21. It's not like you have a lot of leeway here to push these out. And with Crown and Woodward, you've got spending already in FY26. So pushing them beyond September 2025 will have an SSP implication. They would, those projects, just by eyeballing it, they would most likely send those clusters back into moratorium where they are now. So we're going to have those issues to look at. Some of the other projects not yet under construction that have a few empty years in those last 3 years, those might be the ones that we see come back as non-recommended deferrals, maybe not reductions, but deferrals. So that's all I had on the individual schools at this time. As I said, we're going to be revisiting this at our late March meeting because we'll have in hand the non-recommended reductions. There may be other information. Maybe the state aid will be a little clearer at that point. We don't know. But we'll have a lot more ability to parse through these for you a little more at the individual project level.
So before we turn to Mr. Howard, let me just say that part of that strategy in asking for that to be moved back was that it's much closer to, we should have a Build Act passed by then and know what kind of monies we'll be getting from the state when it comes to school construction, which will significantly help in terms of those recommendations. So that is for March 30th. You were correct, Mr. Levchenko. So, Mr. Howard.
Thank you. So the last section of projects to talk about today are the county-wide projects, and the descriptions of those all begin on page 14. So we'll kind of briefly walk through some of those, and there's a couple of them that we've highlighted some questions for MCPS staff that we can go over quickly. And if there's other questions either for today or follow-up that council members want on these countywide projects, we can please let us know that as well. So beginning on page 14, we list the projects, the countywide projects with no changes, meaning the level of effort funding has been requested has been the same as in prior years. And so those are all listed out with their year-by-year project totals. And again, I should mention actually at the start, the staff did not identify a lot of issues with the content of MCPS's request for the countywide projects. But again, the affordability issues we'll have to deal with on the countywide projects as well as the individual school projects. In terms of the projects listed out individually, the first one is the ADA compliance project, and we've already talked about that a little bit with Councilmember Jawando's questions. I do want to note that MCPS does have online a summary of all their ADA compliance work that they've done at the school by school level, which is really nice. You can click on each individual school and you can read the entire report. Although I think that's focused mainly on compliance issues and may not get to some of the other issues that Mr. Adams talked about, that just because something's compliance doesn't mean it's easily accessible. And the council heard some very strong testimony from a student at Wooten High School during the CIP public hearings about some accessibility issues that students face. And I did include a little bit of a table that summarizes some of the compliance data that they've published online. For the school security systems project on page 16, this is a continuation of the work that the council has approved over the past couple years, and this is an area where I thought that we could get an update from MCPS on the status of the security vestibules that we talked about last year, and kind of where we are with the construction of those and how many schools are left.
Mr. Adams.
Sure. So this summer we will be breaking ground on 13 schools to install security vestibules. That leaves 10 additional that are in design, and then 5 of which will be completed in the other capital projects. So there's a total 28, 13 breaking ground this summer, 10 the following, and we should be complete in the next 2.5 years.
Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. Can you tell me what's the status of Belmont Elementary School in Olney regarding the vestibule?
Sure. Belmont is one of the schools that is under design. That is one that we probably will not be breaking ground this summer. What I would note is there's several projects, actually of all the 28 are very similar to a Belmont situation where the main office is buried a little bit deeper into the building. So part of this process is to bring those office spaces out to the front of these schools. So it's a little bit of swapping of academic spaces with the administrative spaces. These projects are deeply disruptive when you're taking out the main entrance. So we've had to spend a particular amount of time, particularly like schools like Belmont, to really think through how and when we will do this so that we can still access the school and still do it in a safe manner as well. So it is one of the schools in our list. It is not going to break ground this summer, but it will break ground the following.
It will break ground when?
Next summer, so summer of 2021.
Okay, and then completion would be roughly?
Yeah, so we're looking to complete these within 6 months once we break ground. Some of the more complicated ones may take a little bit longer, but I foresee that Belmont being complete within 6 months when break ground.
Okay, thank you.
No, I actually have a follow-up to that, because is it just from a perspective of fiscal, or is it that there's more complicated design work that is prohibiting us from moving forward now?
Yes, so these are more about the logistics of the projects, less about the fiscal capacity.
Okay, thank you.
On this project, the overall 6-year request is actually a decrease in funding because of the work that has been done. There is some maintenance of effort or level of effort funding requested kind of in the out years after the main set of vestibules has been completed. And maybe as a follow-up, we can get a list from MCPS of the different schools that fall into the different categories that Mr. Adams mentioned, about the ones that were scheduled for the summer, the ones that are under design, and the ones that will be part of the major capital projects, maybe.
We typically don't print those for security reasons.
Sure.
But would be happy for Mr. Adams to meet with members of the Education Committee individually and just walk through the schools.
If you could meet with staff would be able to, yeah, that's perfectly fine, and I understand.
And if there's any specific schools that council members have questions about, let me know, and then I'll get the information back to you on that.
Excellent, that'll work, yeah, thank you.
The next two projects are facility planning and building modifications and program improvements. Facility planning is a small decrease in the 6-year period, and building modifications, program improvements is a $3 million decrease over the 6-year period. And those projects tend to deal with kind of what's going on with the planning that has to be done, as well as some of the different individual facility work. So it's more project, more specific to kind of other things that are happening within the CIP. On page 17, we get into some of the bigger systemic projects. Roof replacement is the first one. There is a $6.5 million decrease over the 6-year period. However, there is a $9 million increase in FY21 and FY22, the first 2 years of the CIP for roof replacements. The most recent infrastructure maintenance task force report came out this past February, that has updated data for each of for the county government, MCPS, and the college on the kind of backlog for these types of repairs and systemic projects. The recommendation of that report would be an annual cost of $12.4 million for roof replacement for MCPS. So the FY21 request would be in line with what that task force recommends. Again, however, it is an increase over what had been approved previously, so will need to be addressed in the affordability considerations. So the FY21 funds would go towards full or partial roof replacements at Bethesda and Damascus elementary schools, and Kingsview, John Poole, and Westland middle schools. And I think this gets to some of the data that MCPS is collecting with key facility indicators in ways that they can address portions of schools, without having to go through the full, renovation process. PLAR, Plan Life Cycle Asset Replacement Project. This is a area of significant increase. 6-year increase is $14.2 million for the entire CIP, and then increases of $8.9 million and $7.9 million in the first 2 years of the project. The AARC, the annual recommended cost from the task force report, for this project is $76.4 million per year, with a total backlog of $345.7 million. So as you can see, even with the board's increased request, we're well below what the best case scenario would be on this project for doing all the kind of upkeep that we'd like to do on a regular basis. On page 18, we have the HVAC project. And again, this is another area of increase, particularly in the first 2 years. $12 million increase overall for the 6 years, and then $15 million in FY21 and $13 million in FY22. The recommended annual replacement cost for this project is $27.9 million. So the $25 million MCPS is requesting in FY21 is again closer to the goal of where we'd like to be, pending affordability decisions. And that the FY21 funding for this project would fund upgrades or replacements for Clarksburg, Brookhaven, Meadow Hall, and Ronald McNair elementary schools, and the 4th phase of Quince Orchard High School. Restroom renovations is the other kind of ongoing systemic project that's included in the infrastructure maintenance report. The request here is actually a reduction over the 6 years of $7.5 million, small increases in FY21 and 22, and the board's request of $3 million for FY21 is right about at the same level that the task force recommends. The current RevX projects on page 18 and going on to page 19, that's just the finishing out of that project in the schools that Ms. Karamihas put up on the slide earlier. And then on page 19, we have the major capital projects. The difference this year as opposed to last year is that MCPS has broken out this project into 2 different projects. It was one single before. Now it's broken out into elementary and secondary. And there is a very large increase in this project, $282 million overall, because what was approved in last year's CIP and when this was first approved 2 years ago were placeholder dollars. So it was the beginning of the project, some placeholder and planning dollars. And now that there's actually schools identified with different project scopes, they've requested full funding for each of those. The completion dates are listed on page 19. I cannot read them off without looking like Ms. Evans did, but you can see those. And then on page 20, we have a list of each of the individual projects and the proposed funding strings that would occur under the board's request. And then the last, I should note that this is just, again, the first phase of this project, the first 9 schools. So as Councilmember Jawando noted, going forward, probably in the next CIP, we begin to see kind of the next phase in MCPS's plans for that. The last project on page 20 is the outdoor play space maintenance project. And this is the project that was new a couple of years ago to fill in areas where there's small play spaces at schools that are not part of the CUF permitting process, so we're not eligible for their field renovation efforts. And so MCPS has worked to do some projects at individual schools. At the 5 schools that they identified, all those projects have now been completed. At Rolling Terrace, Tacoma Park, Chevy Chase, Sligo Creek, and Flora Singer Elementary. And they're continuing to work to monitor the success of this and working with the Parks Department on the ongoing maintenance and work on these, because of course now that the renovations have all been done, we want to make sure they stay functional as play spaces, and we don't go through the process of renovating and then having to redo it in a couple of years because things didn't work as occurred with some of the other efforts prior to this project. And the request does include some level of effort funding of $450,000 a year in the out years for this project, which is a new would be a new addition. And that is the summary of the countywide projects. If there's any questions?
I actually don't see any, so I think that we've covered a lot today, which is really, really good. I really wanted us to have a robust conversation, so I really want to thank my colleagues for really asking some very in-depth questions as well as comments about what it is that we need to do. The reality is that our needs are great, and the money that we need to support those needs is even greater. And so, this is the reason why all that's encompassed in this is the reason why we continue to advocate at the state level and say we need more support, we need more support. One of the interesting things that I think that we need to at some point explore is that the federal government for a very long time had said quite some time ago that there may be funding when it came to ADA, when they had passed ADA, and support for state and local governments in terms of bringing things on, and nothing ever came to fruition about this. And in the spirit of Senator Van Hollen's bill that deals with the Keeping America's Promise Act, in which he talks about funding for IDEA as well as making sure that we have Title I funding and funding for our students with differing abilities. It really is important for the federal government to also play a role, because it is a federal policy when it comes to ADA as well, in terms of helping, because that's the way in which we can make it so that all of our facilities are more accessible. I mean, I know all too well about what's going on in our park system right now, and a huge amount of outlay in terms of capital that's going on to try and make our park system more accessible. All of the trails that we talk about that are so great, the reality is they're not accessible for many people in our community, and they're trying to do more around that. And so, of course, the same thing applies for our government buildings, including our schools. And so there's so much more that needs to be done, and we really need to have a partnership that's at the federal level when it comes to that. So maybe we can look at coming up with something that we may be able to send to our congressional representatives, just saying in light of some of the challenges that we continue to face and how we're trying to keep pace, and as we highlight the fact of how accessible we want and welcoming we want to be to folks with differing abilities in our communities, we also want to make sure that the federal government plays a role in being a partner and helping us to support that. So we'll see. We've got our lovely NACO conference that's coming up soon, so we can talk about that at the NACO, our National Association of Counties conference as well, and talk about maybe there's some work that NACO can do on our behalf. So I really want to thank you again. All of this happens because of partnership. All of this happens because of dedication and commitment. So thank you to all of our partners who play a role in making sure that our systems are ones that are welcoming, inviting, supportive, and conducive when it comes to learning, and that also are meeting the needs of the greater community as a whole. And I really do appreciate the fact of thinking about those kinds of things as we continue to talk about what our goals are for what we want to see ourselves as a community. Schools play a key role, not in just educating our community, but also serving as those community hubs, serving as community schools, but then also playing a role when it comes to continuing to support economic development opportunities for the county as well. So thank you very much, guys. I think we are adjourned. Thank you. All right. Thank you.